Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Veldsman, and today we will be deep diving into the topic that everybody loves to hate, the topic of performance management. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. To guide our conversation today, I'm joined by a fantastic guest, Megan Bickle, top voice on performance management on LinkedIn. She just shared with me she's a very enthusiastic marathon runner, which we will also get into, and somebody with extensive experience in performance management who will be sharing some of her thoughts today. Megan, welcome to the HR Dialogues.
Thank you so much for having me.
Megan, to get us started, we like to get to know our guests a little bit better on the HR Dialogues. If you can share a little bit about your experience up to now, and maybe the existential question, who is Megan? If we can start there.
Fabulous. Who is Megan? So I am currently in New York City. I grew up in Wisconsin. So a little bit of going from small town USA to the big city. I've got a master's in organization development, which has really helped shape how I think about things such as performance management. My entire background is in talent management, but I've focused on performance management for about a decade. So I don't know if that makes me crazy or gives me a little extra credibility. And then, as you mentioned, I am running my 7th marathon at the end of September. There's something about that mental toughness that I keep saying yes to. Probably just like performance management.
As you've mentioned before we started the recording, all these similarities, right, between those two different worlds. Megan, before we deep dive into that topic, what has been some of the best career advice that you've received up to now?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind at the beginning of my career, as I was playing in this COE world of human resources, the advice that was given to me by an executive was to intentionally take on COE specific roles and then move to a broad role and then take another COE role. And the reason behind that is just the ability of connecting the dots and building out that domain expertise. And so it's, okay, we'll go deep in performance management, but then go broad into the bigger talent management to understand how does performance connect to the other pieces. And then go specialize in culture, engagement, or employee listening, and repeat. And it was really great advice because I feel like sometimes it's really easy to just stay in that specialty versus having the respect, appreciation, and awareness of how everything's interconnected.
I think that's such valuable advice, right? I think something we find at AIHR quite interesting is whenever we talk about HR professionals in their careers, a lot of people actually don't have the perspective, can I call it, on the other side of the table, right? So they typically remain in one specialist domain or they remain more in the generalist type of path. And I think the value that we will see if people are able to connect those dots, and I think HR is a compounded value type of profession, right? So you and I together do a lot more than one discipline on its own. So I think very, very valuable advice to share with the listeners. Thank you for that.
Of course. What a great way to kick things off.
That brings us to the topic, Megan, of today. Right? And I think I want to take a step back because, something that sometimes frustrates is these headlines that we get that said, oh, performance management is dead. We get these headlines that say 98% of managers don't like current performance management, or they say that it does not add any value. So I think performance management struggles really from quite a tough reputation. And my first question to you is, do we still need performance management in today's workplace? And I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate there as we explore the topic.
I love that question. So my short answer is yes, we still need it. And I also think that organizations, we ask a lot of it. Like, I almost feel like, is performance management the Swiss Army knife of HR programs, right? Like it's this one process or program or philosophy, like however you want to box that up. We we ask it to help us identify high potential talent, ensure that we are rewarding and recognizing our employees, that we have equitable compensation practices, that it serves as an accountability mechanism for feedback conversations. It provides career development or career framework. It hopefully provides, coaching. And executives want this process/program to connect to business results. But I feel like in most organizations I've been in, there's a natural bell curve of your performance. You can nicely slot it into, 5% aren't meeting expectations, 85% are, and then 10 to 15 are exceeding. So I feel like, again, yes, it matters. I think organizations ask a lot of this thing, and also fully agree that it's hated. I almost feel like HR needs to hire some kind of like marketing expert. But again, I think the hatred comes from it's really cumbersome, and we as HR professionals don't always do the best job of connecting to the value. And I think sometimes on the surface, leaders are like, oh, this again, like this heavy process where I have to ask for feedback from everyone and then fill out these self-reviews and And to your point, like it doesn't, there's a missing link of this process that I'm doing with my team. How does this actually connect out to the output of our company or the stock price or the things that externally we're held to?
You're absolutely right around the fact that I think we tie so much into the performance practice and into the performance process around all the different touch points. And I think, that's one of its big strengths because people understand and realize its importance. But on the other side, I think we put so much weight on it being able to feed some of these other processes that it almost starts carrying the weight on behalf of them a little bit more. Because, something that I've noticed is very often performance management serves as the process that unearths a lot of other things that are not working well. Oh, strategy has not been clarified. Guess when you find that out? Performance management, right? Organizational design is not effectively running. Guess when you find that out? Oh, when we're trying to do contracting and I don't understand why your objectives and mine is exactly the same. And I think that sometimes, things we don't take into account is that performance, as much as it's a process and a practice and it's integrated with other, things across the HR value chain, it is also this, I almost want to call it a bit of a spotlight that it shines on other parts of the organization for it to be able to flourish. And I think that's where some of the bad reputation comes in, besides now the things and the experience that I think a lot of people have been through.
One time, when I was redesigning performance management for the very first time, and I was, chatting with employees to really get clear on what's broken in the current state, this employee told me that they were bragging that they took a personal day to write their self-review. And then curiosity got the best of me. And since I had access, I had to peek at the self-review. And it was 14 pages long. And, it really highlighted a lack of trust. This employee didn't feel that their leader maybe knew everything that they had done over the year, or that they would be able to speak to it as it related to rewards. The other fun thing that I unearthed in those conversations was one team leaders set goals at the end of the year. So it was more of a look back of hey, we haven't really been talking throughout the year setting goals. So why don't you just tell me what you did? We'll make those your goals. And by the way, you exceeded. But HR said I can only give you X percent.
That's such a good example. And we've all been in those situations where it's 2 months before REM review. And now all of a sudden performance is the hot topic because people have realized, oh, we haven't done much during the course of the year. Or, one of my favorite examples when you're sitting in a COE is when the business unit tells you, don't worry, we've been doing it. It's just not captured anywhere. And that's why you can't see it. Right. Then I'm like, but I hear you, and I'm going to trust that you have been doing it and having the conversations, etc. But we need visibility and transparency on a lot of these things,
right? Because but it also depends on the company culture, right? Because in some cases, and I saw this in one organization where the engineering team they tracked everything in Jira. why am I going to fight with the leadership to force them to duplicate their goals into a different system? It's like, okay, like I'm going to trust you have this process. It works for you. I don't need to see it. But like if this doesn't play out and all of a sudden the feedback blows up that employees don't feel like they're aware of what their goals were, or they don't feel like their performance is being assessed fairly, then we're going to have to talk about like where do the goals need to sit for visibility, versus can we take a step back from our HRCOE lens and say, is it okay that not everyone has their goals in one same system because of how they do their goals? Like, I think that's where it depends.
Yeah. You raise an important point, right? And there's kind of a couple of things that stand out. The first one, you can only do that in a culture where ownership is associated with the right places, because I sometimes think HR professionals, we make the mistake of thinking we own performance, which, actually we don't. We own the practice and we guide the environment and all those things. But ultimately, there's a very strong piece that is owned by line managers and by the business as a business process and as a business practice. The second point I want to make, which I think is really valuable, is context. Context plays such an important role for me in how you drive performance. And if you take context into account, I think at times you move away a little bit from these are the 5 steps we need to follow towards. But if we want to achieve that outcome, what are the milestones we need to hit along the way, and what is the best way? I've always believed you should go with a natural energy in an organization. So kind of go where the energy is already and use that momentum, as opposed to, necessarily trying to swim upstream a little bit as part of that. And then to your point, what is important for you? Because I think at times we get so caught up in, the practice and the process and the rating scale and the bell curves and the reporting and the feedback, and is the 360, is the 180. I think sometimes we miss the point a little bit around, what is it actually really about? So I think those are very, very valuable points that you raise, around depends. I think there's no one perfect way of doing it, right?
Oh, wholeheartedly. And even, and I love that you brought up like ratings or no ratings. I feel like too often performance management gets like that's the headline. Do we have ratings or don't we? And how many times a year? And, whenever I'm asked like, well, what's the best way to do it? And I always say like, well, it depends. It depends on why do you do performance management at your culture? Like, what are you trying to drive? I've seen and done it all. I've removed ratings. I've re-implemented ratings. I've seen shadow ratings. But like it depends. There is no here is the best process for every organization. So agree, context matters.
Yeah, and it's a big realization, because I think performance is slightly different in that way than some of the other center of excellence practices, where there is tried, tested methods and ways. And I'm not saying that, we should go back to designing performance management on the back of a cigarette box. That's not what I'm kind of rooting for. But I think you have to be slightly more open and flexible in this process to really ingrain it into the DNA and the culture and the things that you want to drive. Megan, so what do companies that do this well, what do they do?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the importance of branding. I feel that we as HR professionals, we just have a knack for taking our processes and giving them the most boring name ever, right? It's like, oh, performance at company
Excellence.
X, right? Or leadership development at company X. So if I go back years and years ago to the era of a lot of organizations reimagining performance for their company, we saw the rise of branding. Like Adobe had check-in, Gap had GPS for grow, perform, succeed. And just the language to really make it resonate with the company versus this is our performance management process. So, and I say that from if you're trying to do something different or you're trying to mark a change in what we used to do and now our path forward, focusing on what will you call it and integrate that into the processes, like that's huge. So definitely branding. Also, the uniqueness of the culture. And I think Microsoft is a great example of that, of they on paper essentially had 4 different flavors of performance management with varying degrees of flexibility and accountability, notably, in Europe where the work councils have a little bit more rigor in place. And so really Microsoft took the stance of we're going to zoom out and just say collectively, like, here is our philosophy on how we want people to feel, right? Like really going all in on growth mindset and how does that show up in the culture? How does that show up in our learnings? How does that show up in the conversations that we're setting? And then what role, like from a rigor of what needs to be documented, how many times a year, but also allowing the flexibility of where some countries or business functions needed more or less, but it all aligned. I'm a big fan of the continuous conversation. I don't feel like performance is something that's checked in once a year. I always joke of, for those that are in romantic relationships, you probably aren't just telling your partner once a year, like, hey, great job.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's humorous, but like the same can be said, in the workplace of like, are we, having those conversations or, just checking in and saying like, great job. Like you really nailed it. I'm proud of you. Or like, hey, here's some coaching. Like the next time this comes up, like here's something you might want to do different. But it's those like checking in versus, oh, we haven't talked about any of this and now we've got all this stuff. So continuous conversations, branding, alignment to culture. And I think the last piece that I'd mention is really doubling down on leadership expectations and building capability. I personally believe that leadership is the linchpin within performance management. And so, where organizations have really doubled down on here's what we expect. How do we help our leaders get better? But also how do we ensure that we're holding them accountable?
I've often said, I think leadership is the root cause of all good and all evil of various practices in organizations, right? When you can have a broken practice, but a good, strong, leadership cohort and it works. And the other way around, you can have the best practice, but leadership doesn't support it, doesn't drive it, or not equipped to do it. I love your example around, the branding piece. I've often, challenged some of my teams to ask the question to say, if this was a product, would the consumer buy it with their own money? And if not, why not? Is it boring? Is it not seamless? Is it not suited to a need that we're trying to resolve? And I think that type of wording also then changes it a little bit around how you go and position it in a more exciting way. So no, it's not the same, it's not old wine in new bottles. It's actually a different thing that we want to try with a very different reason behind it, which brings me to the point that you raised around philosophy. I think sometimes in organizations we don't have that conversation around, but what do we believe about people and what do we believe about performance? Any sound performance practice, in my view, has to be built on a very solid philosophy that aligns expectations, which you've also mentioned around leaders, because ultimately it is that component around, what do we expect of people? Do we create the clarity? Do we create the environment? And if not, what are we doing to guide them, to coach them, and to make sure that they can take that next step? I do want to ask you a different question, right? And I think maybe let's flip a little bit towards the other side, because I think we also need to talk about what are we not doing well, right? And what are some of the mistakes that we do make as HR and as organizations when we talk about performance management? And I know there's a variety of mistakes that we can talk about, but what are some of those big pitfalls to avoid that you've seen that kind of stops performance dead in its tracks even before it gets it gets out of the stable?
I think sometimes we in HR unnecessarily overcomplicate it. And I think this also kind of ties to the importance of, like the philosophy, but also the storytelling, right? So let's go back to like, why are we doing this here? Why does this matter? And what's needed? And I think sometimes, if I wear my organizational hat, like, yeah, I want to nerd out on all of the data and really, dive into, what percentage of employees like submitted self-reviews and in what timing and of all the peer feedback, like who are the most popular people, right? Like it's so easy to go down that path versus where do I just need to have some guidelines, like guiding principles but also help people understand what does good look like, right? So even kind of just starting at the beginning of how will we know that we did a good job? Like, what is our goal? Like, fast forward, if this is our annual process, what does good look like? Does good look like 100% completion of reviews? Is this, we really only need data from people leaders in order to drive calibrations, or we only really need performance ratings from leaders to then tie out to compensation recommendations. So again, kind of challenging okay, yep, the whole thing, like, yes, we want employees to fill out reviews, we want peer feedback, but what do we really need? And again, what does good look like to know that we've orchestrated a process that is meeting the needs versus let's throw in all these extra things that we really want like insights on.
But I've seen that mistake so many times, right? And I've often challenged some of my own teams and made the mistake myself, because I'm a typical nerd that loves to say, "Oh, what would be interesting if?" Just because something is interesting does not mean it's valuable. And I think in performance, it is such an important principle to keep in mind, because otherwise we almost steer conversations down the wrong rabbit hole, where people then start exploring things that are actually not relevant at all to the conversation. And we start getting into these. And I was once in a conversation where we had to do a whole study on, the is it better to have 3 decimals after the rating scale, or to have a 7 point versus a 5 point? I mean, you've missed the mark when that's the level of conversation that we're having, pertaining to performance. So I think the advice on simplicity, and something I've seen is consistency as well. Give things time to really get through, because I think performance is unfortunately one of those where you kind of have to go through the cycles to see whether certain things work or not. I'm not saying leave things if they're not working, but give certain things time to mature a little bit, and don't just immediately change everything every single time you go into a new contracting season. That's one of the things I've seen, at least.
Right, because then there's that level of change fatigue where the organization is like, oh, every time you announce performance, something's different. Like, to your point, let's just smooth it out. Let's just give it a couple cycles, make small tweaks versus trying to overhaul too much too soon. Because the other thing is really understanding performance in the context of everything else that's happening. Like, so for example, when is your review process? What else is happening? Is finance trying to like close out things? Is your sales team in a rush to get those last minute deals? Like, is procurement swamped because they're trying to support the sales team? Like, so even just zooming out a couple clicks and saying like, what else is going on in the business at these timings? Because you're competing for people's energy, time, commitment, right? And so having that versus, oh, we've designed our performance management process in a vacuum and we have no connection to like, oh, so there's a board meeting, or oh, there's that, or oh, that team's got their quarterly offsite and they're out of pocket for a week.
Yeah, but I've seen that so many times, right? And I fell into that trap as well. So we were implementing performance in quite a big multinational organization, and the retail side of the business didn't matter what we did. Typically, they didn't participate in performance, were seeking shortcuts around the process, always came with some really good and sometimes valid and not so valid excuses on why certain things couldn't happen. Until we had the conversation to say, but what's really happening? And they said, your process and things are great. It's just at completely the wrong time. You expect us to do it close to quarter end or close to year end, even worse. That's when all my managers are pushing sales, because that's important for us to reach our targets as a business at that point in time. And if we ran it a month earlier, a month later, very different conversation, because then people actually want to sit down and have those conversations with people as well. But we were driven by, can I almost say, a governance type of deadline that was tied to financial year end and the REM process and all those different elements. But by having that conversation, we were able to flex it in a very different way. And I think that's so important. Understand your business rhythm and what's happening. Otherwise, you're forever going to fight a losing battle.
Oh, wholeheartedly. Or even, I think this is where, having that philosophy on what do you expect of performance, but also ensuring and enabling leaders of if they want to do things more or less. And so, for example, the first time that I redesigned performance management was in the video game industry. And the sales team wanted to do like performance check-ins on a monthly and quarterly basis, right? They're sales driven. They wanted to check in on those metrics. But the game studio, they wanted a cycle that really tied to the launch of a game, which could be 2 or 3 years, right? And so having that happy medium of what do we actually need at the organizational level, which ties to the annual comp, but then also where can we provide more flexibility? So the game studio is like, okay, you can run an additional cycle that's specific to the launch of your game where you want to go deeper on these things. And sales could, check in on metrics more frequently to then align to the organizational. So just approaching it from we want to set leaders up for success. Here's what we believe in. Here are the tools. Here's the process. Here's the resources to help you. But like, if you want to, take it upon yourself and do quarterly check-ins, like go for it. Right. So I think that's that balance of, like you said, like no one really owns it, but it's more of how do you set others up for success?
Yeah, and I think how you create that environment where people can make those decisions, in terms of what's going to work best, aligned to your point, the philosophy of what and why we actually do it. You raise an important point where I often get this question to say, oh, but no, performance needs to be standardized. We will have one approach for the entire organization. Then I tend to ask the question, does everybody do the exact same thing in your organization? Same environment, same skill set, same type of output? If the answer is no, why are we then trying to drive a process that might or might not be a good fit for them? So, and I think if you start aligning on philosophy level, I think you can be a lot more flexible on, some of the other pieces around how it lands in sales versus how it lands in, the tech department or in the gaming department or in some of your creative departments as well. And I think we just need to think a little bit beyond. Standardization has got its place, but I sometimes think it can be a little bit inhibiting if we really want to get people to start engaging with the practice like performance.
I joined an organization and they did not have a formal performance process. They were very large and it was kind of cringy that they didn't have a technology in place to support it. But I was like, well, regardless of what the company is doing or is not doing, I'm a leader, so I can just decide for my team what we're going to do. And so I implemented quarterly check-ins, just as a way of like, let's check in on what have you accomplished this quarter? What have you learned? Like what were the opportunities? And you just building that rhythm for my team, from a like, here's what I believe in, here's how I lead. And then this allows us to quickly check in on, where are things going sideways, or when it got to the annual process, to look back at our 4 quarters worth of documented conversations and then pull out the summaries. And so I would say it goes back to like, which hat am I wearing? Am I wearing my organizational hat, or it's like, yeah, maybe in a perfect world, I want, everything documented in one tool, and, I want to run my metrics and blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I just want to know that employees are having conversations with their leaders, and at any given point, they're aware of what are my priorities right now, and am I doing a good job? Right? Like, so it's that balance of just getting to the overly simplification of, on a day-to-day basis, I would hope that every single employee, feels like they know what's expected of them, and that they're talking to their leader, So again, if the leader, whatever they're doing in terms of how many one-on-ones, how am I checking in on goals, as long as that's happening, like me wearing my organizational hat, like I could care less how, like the semantics, as long as it's happening in a manner that works for that team.
Yeah, and I think it brings me, Megan, to my next question, which you kind of referenced earlier around leadership. And we're talking about the fact that we need to find something that works. And actually, what is important is, are the conversations taking place? Is clarity being provided? Support being provided? I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. How do you get managers and leaders to actually care about performance? And I was in I still remember I was in a boardroom where one of the very senior leaders made the comment, and I was the owner of performance at the time, where they made this comment to say, this performance practice of yours, it's not helping us to do our business at all. Sometimes you have that type of perspective from a lot of leaders and managers. So what do you do if you're in an organization and, to be honest, they just don't care about performance at all? How do you start addressing that?
Yeah. Because I think this can also apply to other HR programs and practices. I think one thing we have to work really hard at as HR professionals is speaking the language of the business. So I'm not going to go into a meeting and try to convince leaders why performance management matters. I want to look at it through the lens of what matters to them. So how can I help them understand, like, hey, as we're getting close to making decisions around compensation rewards, like, do you feel right now you've got the tools to identify who's going above and beyond and how you would reward them? Like, would you reward them with 5%, 8%? Like, do you have the tools? Do you have the tools to identify, like, who's your up and coming talent? Do you feel like you've got the tools to identify, like, what are the development needs? And so kind of framing it from that approach of, do you have what you need, or how are things working for you in identification of high potential talent? If you won the lottery and left, like, who's going to take your place? Do they know? What do they need? How do we develop them over the next course of the year? So I would talk about everything that ties to performance, but without saying those words, and really just kind of framing it from a, like, hey, leader, I know that you've got a lot on your plate. Like, ultimately, like, do you feel like, is your team being stretched? Do you know who's at risk for leaving the organization in the next year? Do you know, what career conversations need to be had? Do you need help with creating some developmental opportunities? Blah, blah, blah.
Mm. I love that, though, because I think it does place a very different flavor to the conversation. It's not so much about convincing people. It's a lot more about aligning to the problem that they are facing and bringing something that's going to work for them to elevate based on the philosophy and the principles that you hold. So
Right.
I
It's
think
like
very valuable.
we have everything in HR to help set the business up for success. And, if a leader is saying, like, hey, this thing isn't working, like, help me understand what's broken. Like, we both want the same thing. We want this to work. we want our leaders to believe that the pieces that we have, like, will actually, help them in the long run. So help me understand, like, what's broken, what's not working. Is it the tool? Is it timing? Is it the resources? Is it accountability of leaders? Like, I'm all for, with respect to surface, like, what's not working, like, because we can't fix what we don't know isn't working, but also, just again, to your point of, like, doubling down on talking to all those things without saying performance management.
No, exactly. I sometimes think we and I know it's important, but I sometimes think we do a disservice by saying, I'm the performance management specialist or head in an organization, and then everybody's immediately, okay, what are we talking about at the moment? And
Or they're groaning at you. They're like, oh, I hate performance management. You're like, cool, that's what I do.
Yeah, that's what I love to do, and that's what we're talking about today, by the way. So no, I think so. I think you said in jest earlier, sometimes HR and performance, we do need a bit of a public relations PR type of campaign around a lot of the practices, not just performance. I think there's quite a few of them, that helps people understand what they're actually trying to achieve. Megan, I want to ask you a last question from my side. If you look back on your, really great experience that you've had in performance management up to now, what do you wish you knew at the beginning that you now know about performance that might have influenced you slightly differently at the beginning of your career in engaging in these performance processes?
Or maybe I would have ran away. Like, this is insane.
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. So the very first time that I redesigned performance management, so I was working at a subsidiary of a French-owned company. My VP of HR came up to me after talking with the executive team about performance management. And he was like, I'm sick of listening to my peers complain about this. Can you just like take a month, do some research, and come back to me with like a proposal on how we can do this better? So, not a lot of guidance or structure. And one thing that's interesting about that experience is the majority of the compensation element tied out to performance was done in spreadsheets. I say that and it's kind of cringy, and like I don't even want to go down the path of how much room for error that can lead to. But I say that because then fast forward to the next time that I was involved in performance management, I was missing some of that knowledge around, from a tooling standpoint, things such as, well, when does the board meet to talk about executive compensation, and when does like the CEO need to sign off on budgets, and where do you do the modeling of what do we anticipate from rewards and recognition, like comp modeling. Because the first time I did it, it was so like loosey goosey. Again, spreadsheets. It was managers saying like, "Hey, Dieter, I'll let you promote your person if I can. I won't promote my person, but can I have like 10K from your budget?" So there's a lot of like inner negotiations around like titles versus money. So it wasn't truly managed from a here's your comp ranges. And so to go back in time, I wish I had more exposure to the inner workings from a compensation perspective, because that ties into the overarching process and timing. And then also how, as you're outlining for your leaders, here's our timeline, helping them understand why does it take so long, right? And it really is the behind the scenes stuff versus what's on paper, and then where can you streamline and what things do you separate, because sometimes these processes, from start to end on paper, it takes like 4 months, and you've got leaders saying, I just had my year-end performance conversation, in January. Why do I have to wait till the middle of March to talk with them or to tell them about their rewards? So again, the first time that I redesigned performance, I feel like I got lucky in a sense of some of the complexity was removed. However, then the next time that I was involved in performance, it was like, oh, I didn't know about all these things that happen in most organizations because we just did that on spreadsheets. Cool.
That was one of the most valuable pictures, that somebody ever drew to me was in an organization where we had to analyze the performance process was, this is the process, but these are all the things that needs to happen around it, which is where it fits. And I think, a big lesson I learned was if you understand where it fits, you understand where it gets information from and what it needs to give information to, and how does that inform certain level decisions. And for me, that was a huge eye opener around the fact, to exactly your point, it has to go to a board and to a Remco at some point. Why? That's why we need to be able to do things a couple of weeks in advance, for example. And I think that puts a bit of a different perspective to it. And it's okay to share that with employees. They know these things get discussed. You don't have to tell them, we're going to have your final rating, and then for 3 months, we're going to say nothing. And then all of a sudden, one day, poop, we pop up again and we give you the feedback post that, right?
Right. And I think, to your point, something that I did, the next time that I was redesigning performance manager, like just mapping out end to end all of like the inputs and outputs.
And I think that just gives a different conversation and flavor to people also being involved and knowing that they are co-creating a bigger picture around a lot of those different things. And it's not just a tick box execution type of exercise for them. But Megan, I can't believe I want to wrap for us around some of the fantastic insights that you've shared with us. And I think a couple of things that stood out for me was, be careful around the language that we utilize around performance, and make sure we speak the language of the business whenever we're engaging with them. I love the fact that you spoke about it, that it's not about performance management, it's about the problem that we're aiming to solve, and aligning the conversations with that in order to engage and get stakeholders around the table. We spoke about the fact that context is important. So context sometimes rules standardization a little bit, because it's more about best fit and what we want to achieve. and some of the flexibility that really folds into that. You made the point that yes, performance is still important. It's still something we need to get right in organizations. It's not a practice that we won't have in a couple of years' time. I actually think we will do a lot more of it as we start moving into the future there. And I love the fact that you spoke about that it's part of a natural flow in an organization and a cycle and a calendar with inputs and outputs that you need to be aware of in order to paint that particular picture. Megan, thank you very, very much. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and really appreciate the work that you're doing and being willing to share that with us. Any last words from your side, and where can people follow the great work that you're doing?
Oh, goodness. Follow me on LinkedIn. Any last pieces of advice for those of you that have performance management in your title? Don't take it personally. People just love to hate on the process. And, I think just breaking it down, just it's the storytelling, and this work still matters. So thank you so much for the conversation. It's been lovely.
Thanks so much, Megan. And to everybody listening, with that word, signing off from the HR Dialogues, and we will see you in our next episode.